When it comes to the armament of the Mayflower, judging by the Mayflower 2, on my most recent trip there, we had noticed that some of the cannon doors were open and some were closed. And it didn't have the full complement of cannons aboard. The area that I remember the most was just below the stern castle where the rudder is. They have two openings, and they had one cannon. And he said it'd be easier to just move the cannon from side to side as opposed to having two. They have openings also on the main deck, and they have openings on the gun deck that have the covers. But when it comes to the rest of the armament, the Mayflower was believed to be heavily armed, especially for a merchant ship. She did have a minion cannon, and these cannons had range up to a mile, a Saker cannon, and two base cannons. In addition to these cannons, she may have also carried 10 more cannons lining each side of the gun deck. At the Mayflower 2, there are cannons that are on the docks that was supposedly part of the ship. But not a lot is known about the cannons or the armament of the Mayflower. And again, I'm going by the Mayflower 2. So when it comes to the crew, it is estimated that the Mayflower had a crew of 30. That included officers and men before the mast, which is the crew. The officers may have comprised of the following: 4 master's mates, who also assisted the captain, alternating with him in charge of sailing the ship, 4 quartermasters, a surgeon who would be less skilled than a physician, but would have been trained at a university, and they were associated with barbers and wielders of sharp instruments and were members of the city livery. The carpenter, who had probably learned his craft as an apprentice at sea or in a shipyard. He would have had a number of assistants or mates. The cooper, the cook, the boatswain, who was one that held the most ancient title in the ship's crew. He was in charge of maintenance and the rigging in the ship's boats, and he mustered the crew and allocated their daily duties. And the gunner. These are all, of course, in addition to the captain. When it comes to her officers, the 2 master's mates with previous New World sailing experience were John Clark, who was 45 at the time, and Robert Coppin. Clark had been a ship's pilot on a voyage to Jamestown Colony in 1611, when he had been captured by the Spanish and imprisoned in Cuba before being taken to Spain. He suffered under interrogation but was released and returned to England in 1616. Clark resumed his maritime occupation and became involved in transporting cattle from England to Jamestown. He is reputed to have been the first mate hired for the Mayflower's crew by Weston and Cushman. Robert Chopin had had some experience of whaling in the North Atlantic. Clark and Choplin were assisted by master's mates Andrew Williamson and John Parker. All merchant seamen of the day had the chance of rising to mate or master. Because of literacy and numeracy were much less important at the time than navigational knowledge, which was mainly carried in their heads. Christopher Martin was the ship's governor or purchasing agent, whose task was helping to equip the Mayflower for the voyage. John Alden, born and bred in Harwich, was the ship's cooper and in charge of storing provisions on board, probably the cousin of Christopher Jones. He married a passenger named Priscilla Mullins in the colony after she nursed him back to health when he became ill. The ship's surgeon was Giles Healy, had completed his apprenticeship and became a freeman in 1619, and was a member of the Company of London Barber Surgeons, was licensed to practice. The cook, gunner, and the boatswain are unknown. Another of the ship's officers was a man known in the records simply as Master Leevor, who may have been one of the Captain Jones's right-hand men by virtue of his title. The tasks of the crewmen before the mast were many and varied. Before sailing, most ships would have needed some sort of repairs after their previous voyage. Damage may have been sustained by the masts and sails, while the wooden hull might have been damaged or simply suffered from hard use. All these fractures must have been in need of refurbishment or replacement. The constant strain from the wind, stress and mass in the arms, while waves that batter the hull. It would weaken the structure, which often required extensive scraping to remove marine growth, and recaulking and tarring of the ship. Once at sea, the crewman's life on board was regularly fraught with danger. While the ship was underway, his work held some real hazards, particularly when he was working aloft. This involved climbing the shroud lines up to the yards and standing on foot ropes while working 30 to 50 feet above the deck. Here the sails could be furled and taken in. The rolling motion of the ship or loosen one's footing on a wet yard might cause a crewman to fall on the deck, which may have been fatal in some instances. Hazardous work often had to be undertaken all night during a raging storm, when the captain ordered that sails needed to be reefed or furled or compensate for the wind strength. Lashed by winds and driven rain, sailors needed to know their way around the rigging well enough in order to work it in total darkness, their hands and fingers aching and numb from the cold. It was certainly no better at deck level, because during a storm the chances of being washed overboard were high as the sea spilled onto the open deck. When it comes to personal possessions, a sailor would bring a sturdy wooden sea chest on board with him, usually containing clothes and a few personal items. His clothing would consist of a woolen pullover shirt with a hood, woolen knee-length trousers with long woolen stockings, and a knitted cap. They did have shoes, but they often went barefoot to avoid slipping on the decks and the ropes. No clothing provision was made for bad weather unless the sailor brought it himself. Some sailors might have had several changes of clothing to allow for drying of the soaked garments and to avoid sleeping in wet clothes. The sailor may have a fiddle in their sea chest to provide some music or song and dance during the off-duty moments. When it comes to sleeping, during the 16th century, sailors slept wherever they could find an empty space on deck or with the cargo. Well, my friends, I just wanted to give you a little bit of history on the crew and the armament of the Mayflower. Another little tidbit when it comes to the history of Thanksgiving. So, my friends, until my next video, happy Thanksgiving, and I'll talk to you soon.